Today, I want to talk to you about managing by commitment and not by expectation or assumption. See, that to me is the essence of blowing the gap away. Getting rid of gap thinking, getting rid of assumption and expectation is managing by commitment. And so what I want to do today is show you what I mean by that. This to me is the most important thing, I believe the most important leadership lesson that you can have. And it really, to me, is representative of a molecule. It's like the molecule of something that done right changes it. And I call it the circle of commitment. This molecule in your life will change you for the better. And the circle of commitment is what I call it. Unless commitment is made, Peter Drucker said, there are only promises and hopes. There are no plans. All right. So let me break this down because I think it's really helpful to understand this. So in any circle of commitment, when we move ourselves out of the gap, out of expectation and assumption and into managing by commitment, there are two players in this scenario, in this molecule. There are two players. There's the requester and there's the performer. The requester and the performer. Now, you can call it the conductor of the choir. You can call it the leader of the team. You can call it the delegator, the delegatee. You can call it the manager and the managed. I don't care what you call it, but for the sake of helping to explain it, let's call it the requester and the performer. Now, within this molecule, there's a series of steps. Within this circle of commitment, there are a series of steps. The first is the request. The requester defines and creates a request which is going to the performer. There is a period of negotiation that is either enhanced by the history of doing this or reduced by the history of doing this or expanded based on learning it and working with somebody new. But there's a request that goes out from the requester to the performer in which there's negotiation, and then there is agreement. Once agreement is processed by the performer and the requester, the performer executes the request, and then the circle is completed when we get acceptance. So that's in essence what the circle is. Request, negotiation, agreement, execution, acceptance. And the circle goes like that. And I'm now going to dig into the details of this because it's critical. And it feels like, oh man, you're going really deep into this. And yet so often I find many of the problems that you have by being stuck in the gap are solved by managing by commitment. And so if you understand this and you understand that the implications of each of these steps, you are much more likely to resolve a whole bunch of issues in your business that would go away in a heartbeat if you manage by commitment. All right, so let's start with the request. So when I'm creating a request for someone, for a performer on my team, the first thing I do is I ask myself, what are the conditions of satisfaction? So of this thing that I want done, what are the conditions of satisfaction? What does their commitment entail? So if I'm going to ask somebody to do something, what kind of commitment are they going to have to make to doing this? What are the expected reporting intervals? And what's the timeline and due date, right? And so in essence, all of those together for me come down to this bottom line statement, which is, do I know what done means? If I'm going to make a request, I absolutely explicitly, as the requester, need to be clear on what done looks like. So let's just take an example. Let's assume I'm going to call my friend and I want to have them pick me up, or I want to pick them up and go out for coffee, right? So my request to them is, let's go out for coffee. The request starts with, in my mind, going, well, I'd like to go out for coffee tomorrow morning. I'd like to do that around 7 o'clock in the morning, have breakfast kind of coffee, because I'd really like to catch up with them before work. What's their commitment entail? Basically being willing to get together, coming out, if I'm going to pick them up, coming out their front door, meeting me, getting in the car, Is there a reporting interval? Well, you know what? I think probably worth before I leave in the morning, I just text and get their confirmation that we're still on. And timeline and due date, well, tomorrow morning. That's essentially the agreement. So I know what done means when I'm just thinking about having a coffee with somebody, right? So when you're thinking about any project, any task, any action that's going to be done by somebody else that you're going to delegate to, then you have to know explicitly what done means. See, the enemy of accountability is ambiguity. And so often when I look at leaders, when I look at myself, one of the problems that we face is when we ask our team members, when we ask our outsourced providers, our vendors, we're not clear on what done looks like. We're ambiguous about that. And so that's the enemy of accountability. All right. So the next stage then, once we have in our mind what the request is, then the next piece of the puzzle is the negotiation phase. And it's in the negotiation phase where I go to the performer and I negotiate with them in some degree of back and forth the actual request that I have. So if I know what done means, then I'm going to go to that person and say, I want you to do the following task. And I'm going to clarify that request with them. I'm going to ask their capabilities. I'm going to work with them through what their existing priorities are related to this task. I'm going to make sure they have the resources they need. I'm going to actually talk to them about what done looks like and how would they respond to what my expectation of the conditions of satisfaction are. And in reality, what we're doing here is making sure that the performer is clear on the request. And that's what negotiation is. And sometimes, let's go back to the coffee example. So I call my friend and I say, hey, I'd love to get together for coffee tomorrow. I'd love to do it around 7 o'clock. I'll pick you up and we will meet. We should be done by 8 o'clock. I just want to catch up on, how you are in life and have coffee and maybe a breakfast. Let's do it at Starbucks, wherever. And that's basically the negotiation. And so the person responds back and goes, well, I'd love to do that. Problem is, I have to get my kid off to school. And so it's probably going to be 7:30 before I can actually meet you. Would 7:30 be okay? And you go, oh yeah, that's okay. I can only stay for about 45 minutes, but I'd still like to do that. So instead of an hour, 7:30 to 8:15, I need to be to work by 8:30. So that gives me 15 minutes. I've got nothing else planned, but I've got to get my kid to school. And so notice what's happening. And you're going, yeah, okay. And the other thing, oh, by the way, don't pick me up. I'm going to go on my own. I'll meet you there, right? So now what we've done is my request to do one thing has now met with negotiation. We see that when we're doing it with a friend, but often with somebody that works for us, we have no negotiation phase. And without negotiation, the performer lacks investment in the commitment. And so it's really important when you go through this process that you clarify the request, you know what done means, and then you negotiate it. Now, there are times that negotiation is limited and you're going to have to up the specific request. But unless there is a period of doing that, a lot of times, again, you jump back into, without negotiation, assumption and expectation because you're not clear on a commitment. And it's impossible to get commitment unless the performer is involved in clarifying the request and changing the done and updating it like we did with the coffee scenario. All right. So we next get to the agreement. So if we've delivered the request and we've negotiated with the performer what the adjusted reality of the agreement is or the actual commitment is, and there's a clear new done, and we've ensured that they can do it, they will do it, they're able to do it, they have the budget, time, and resources, and all of that's structured, then we ask a really important question. And this question, interestingly, was one I learned years ago when my very first job out of college was to be a minister. And when you performed a ceremony of marriage in the particular place that I was licensed to do so, the only requirement at that point is to ask a question of both participants in the marriage ceremony. And that request or requirement is, will you marry this other person? Will you? And there's a deliberate question that comes as a way to solidify the agreement. And so when you've negotiated the request that you've made with the performer, ultimately, will you do that? So let's go back to our coffee example. So I've negotiated with my friend the pickup. They're coming at 7:30. They're going to drive themselves. We're only going to meet for 45 minutes. They have to get to work. They got to get their kid to school beforehand. And we do all that. And so the final thing is, I say, okay, so 7:30 tomorrow at this coffee shop, at this place, we'll meet for 45 minutes. Are we good? And that's sort of a colloquial way of saying, will you? Will you be there? Are we committed? And the agreement is the actual shaking of hands, the contractual commitment that happens between you and a staff member, you and a vendor, you and somebody in your community who you're getting to do something for you. If there's no clear commitment, then if there's no acceptance, there's no response to that will you question or some version of that, you don't have an agreement. All right, next stage is the execution. And so in the execution stage, this is really going back to the agreed to definition of terms. Is there a reporting interval? So let's say that on the coffee scenario, 7 o'clock in the morning, my friend texts me to say, hey, yeah, we're still on. I'll see you at 7:30. Is there any feedback that's required based on what the performer is learning? Are we meeting the conditions of satisfaction? And so the performer's job really at this point is to ensure that they follow the conditions of satisfaction, is to make sure that they're delivering on the agreed to promise, the commitment they made to a specific task, outcome, project, whatever it is, in the way it was agreed to. Now, some interesting things happen. If the commitment is to be broken, it's the performer's responsibility to renegotiate the commitment. So if it's impossible to get that done, so let's say in the coffee scenario, it's 7:15 and all of a sudden my friend realizes they're stuck in traffic taking their kid to school and they can't be to the coffee shop by 7:30, then it's their responsibility. And I'm just giving you an example. We wouldn't do this with friends, but often it happens with friends. My friend would be responsible to now text me and go, hey, looks like I'm going to be 7:40 before I get there, stuck in traffic at the school, something like that. You get the point, but there's a renegotiation that needs to take place if the execution of the agreement cannot happen. One other thing that I think is important to remember is if substitution occurs. So if I give a task to you and you in turn give it to somebody else, you're ultimately still responsible as the performer to the execution, even if somebody else is doing it. So you can't blame somebody else if you made the commitment with me. And that's an important thing that happens in a circle of commitment. To ensure that execution happens. If somebody else does it, they're responsible to the almost like a mini circle of commitment from there for that particular delegated task that you've agreed to the performer with. You're not, as the requester, ultimately responsible for the delegatee's activity. You're only responsible to be in agreement with the performer, and the engagement and the circle of commitment is with them. I hope that makes sense, because that's a little caveat that often happens. The performer will often say, well, Joe didn't get it done, or Mary didn't do her part. And that's not your responsibility as the requester. It's part of a circle of commitment for the performer to understand, in terms of the conditions of satisfaction, that they are ultimately responsible for this request, even if they delegate it. All right. Finally, we get to the final stage of the circle of commitment, and that is acceptance. And acceptance is by the requester. The performer brings the completed task or documents, or depending on the conditions of satisfaction and what done looks like, the performer comes to the requester, comes back to you and says, okay, I recognize the completion. And you have to confirm that the task has been completed, and it was completed based on the conditions of satisfaction. Granted, this is really formal the way I'm describing it, but commitment isn't complete until acceptance is confirmed. So the circle of commitment is not clearly completed until it goes around the circle in a complete way. So there you see this, the circle of commitment, the molecule of what a promise is made of to ensure that things get done, that you're not living in the gap by expectation and assumption, and that you're living by commitment. So what do you do now? Well, with this, I'm going to go back. With this commitment, this circle of commitment, I would suggest the first thing you do is start small. Start small to do it. So let's assume that a simple thing like your kids, you're working, you have kids at home and you're asking them things. So just take the time to stop and go, well, what is done look like for me? Don't just assume and expect kids to do what you want them to do. Practice small. Go, okay, if I want their room clean, what does a clean room look like? Like, actually process that in your head. Think it through and go, what's that look like? Okay, I want the bed to look like this, and I want toys in this particular fashion, and I want clothes in this area done this way, and have an idea of what done looks like. Talk to your kid about it, like negotiate it with them. Ask them, will they do this? And follow the circle all the way around, but practice small. But keep practicing. So practice small at home. Practice small at work with your team. Practice in little ways, like you're asking somebody to do a specific task. Stop and go, okay, as the owner, as a manager in this particular situation, what is it that I want done? What's done look like for me? And articulate it for yourself, and then articulate it to them, so that there's a level of negotiation that happens before you say, hey, will you do that? Are you committed to doing that for me by this date at this time in this way? Yes. Okay, do it. Oh, thank you for doing that. That's exactly what I wanted. That's what done looked like to me. So you've completed the circle, and that's a really important process. So do a lot of practice. Keep practicing, and then ensure that you're beginning to create consistent commitments. And the more you create consistent commitments in small ways, then you can grow it. And then finally, engage the team. And this is where I believe some real magic happens. Because once you start to engage the team, and you begin to teach the circle of commitment to them, then cool stuff happens. I remember years ago when I taught my team the circle of commitment, what starts to happen over time is that you give your team permission to clarify things with you. So Janelle, who works with me, one of the cool things that she will often say to me is, just so that we have a circle of commitment in place, because I fall back into assumption and expectation, and I'm very easy to go back into the gap. Because I've taught it to my team, Janelle will often say to me, let's just make sure we've got a circle on commitment on this if I've asked her to do something. And she clarifies what done looks like. She clarifies a due date. She clarifies my conditions of satisfaction. And that's an important step in the process of teaching it to your team. There are two options regarding commitment. You're either in or you're out. You're either going to live in an expectation and assumption world, or you're going to live outside of it. You're going to live in a commitment world. Expectation and assumption, live in the gap. Disappointment, frustration, anxiety, anger. Circle of commitment, live by managing your commitments within your company, within your organization. Don't get stuck in these weird places where you're always living in this frustrating zone. Ultimately, what you want to do is create a culture of commitment in your company. That's what you want. That's what will get you the results that you want. Now, I've said a lot here, and I've driven it at you fast, and I've given you a whole overview of what this looks like. The circle of commitment is really a fundamental building block for you in your leadership in your business. It's fundamental to you. It's fundamental to your team. It's fundamental to your management team, your supervisory team, to your entire team. Because when you create a culture of commitment, then something changes in your business. And I realize that this seems like, is it that important? And I would say without question, this is critically important. Like I said at the beginning, if I were to only teach one skill, if there was only one skill I could pass on to every one of you, and I had only one skill to give, and this was my very last ability to share something with you, this is the specific lesson I teach you. The circle of commitment. The way to build a culture in your business and in your life that allows you to manage by commitments instead of by expectation and assumption. I hope that helps. We'll talk to you soon.